Hi, everyone. Welcome to chapter 17 from The Art of Public Speaking. We're doing chapter 17. Um, as we move forward, please make sure you keep up with the book. If you have it, it's a great opportunity to actually learn the terminology as I speak for it. And I'm also going to have the book here in front of me as we go through the slides, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. All right, so let's get started. So when you're talking about the methods of persuasion, and that's what this chapter is about. This chapter is about how do we persuade someone? How do we persuade an audience to do? It doesn't just we can't just say please, pretty please, and that's sort of one way of doing it. But it's not the only way of doing it. And actually, please, pretty please does actually fall under something that we're going to talk about a little bit later, as far as how do you persuade people. But that's the idea. What makes someone persuasive or a speech persuasive is what we're talking about here. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So the first thing that we talked about building credibility is having ethics. All right. Now, when we're talking about building credibility, credibility is that you have the the education, the experience, or just the overall knowledge to talk about something. If you want to persuade someone to buy a certain type of vehicle and you've never driven that vehicle before, it's kind of hard to do that. It's like, so you're telling me I should do this, but you've never done it before. That doesn't make any sense to me. If it's so good, why haven't you done it? And so ethics really plays a key role in credibility. It's doing what's right for the right reasons, right? And some of the factors that come up with credibility are those things that we mentioned earlier: education, experience, those things that actually show that, okay, this person knows what they're talking about. All right, now there's three types of credibility specifically. There's the initial credibility, there's the derived credibility, and there's the terminal credibility. Okay, now credibility is that credibility that you have as a speaker prior to you saying a single word, right? As an example, when you take my class, as your instructor, I have a certain amount of credibility. Before you even stepped into the class or logged in online, before you even did anything to meet me in person, I had some things going for me. One, I was educated. You need to make sure that I have at least a master's degree in order to teach this course. And you know that that master's degree has to do with communication studies. So right there, that education, that gives me credibility. Now, derived credibility is that credibility that you get during the speech. That's when somebody says, yep, this person knows exactly what they're saying, right? That's derived credibility. And terminal credibility is the total credibility that you get at the end of the speech. It's a culmination of what I thought you were plus what you gave me, and then, yep, this person's on board. I know exactly what they mean, and I know they're in the right place, right? That's terminal credibility. So now that we understand what credibility is, how do we enhance it? Well, there's a couple ways. One, you can explain your confidence. What makes you good at it? Do you have education? Do you have experience? How did you get that experience? No, those are things that you sort of use to explain um, your to your audience. How is it that you're qualified to talk about it? The next thing is establish common ground with your audience. In other words, how are you and I alike? How is it that I know what you're going through, and therefore when I'm giving you advice, it's coming from a good place and in a place of experience? So some of the things that I do with my students is, oh yeah, I know what you've been through. I was a student before. Oh, I know exactly what you mean. I was there before. I've had difficulty doing this. I've had difficulty doing that. And so a lot of times with my students, what I do, especially if it's face-to-face communication, I'll give them a brief history about how I got to be a teacher and the experiences that I had and my times as a student. And what that does is that in my audience being my students, that builds sort of a rapport and a common ground with my students. The next thing is you want to deliver your speeches fluently and expressively and with conviction. Say what you mean and mean what you say, right? Express yourself. Have a smile. If you're happy, be happy and use words that show that you're happy. If you're sad, be sad. Be somber, right? And show, the sort of use the words and the expressions that sort of go along with that. Okay. All right. The next thing is using evidence. All right. Evidence is those things that you use in order to um, sort of support your ideas. Okay. Um, these are supporting materials that you find in other readings, in videos, in articles. These are all supporting ideas. Now, when you're talking about evidence, one of the things that we talk about is a case study. A case study is like an experiment. That's something that occurred and you get the results, and based on those results, this is what you can then assume to be true based on those results. So if there was a case study about how lying to kids about Santa is a bad thing, well then you do a case study and then you learn that hey, maybe we shouldn't tell Santa that tell kids with Santa's real. Maybe we should be upfront with our kids about that. Well, that's left into interpretation. But let me give you my supporting ideas to let you know that, hey, this is what this study showed, these were the effects, and then maybe something to consider. Now, some of the tips for using evidence is use specific evidence, right? Make sure it's very specific. Don't make it vague and open. Should we lie to kids? Well, that's vague. But should we lie to kids about Santa? That's more specific. The next thing is using novel evidence. In other words, is it unique? Is it new? Is it 20 years old? Is it 30 years old? Is it 100 years old? Well, some of those things still hold true, but for the most part, man, society has evolved and things have changed. And so you want to make sure that it's new, it's contemporary, it's unique. The next thing is that is use evidence from credible sources. Where are you getting your information from, right? If you're going to talk about the Lakers and you are going to say that you got your information from ilovethelakers.com, well, that pretty much says that you're a little biased, right? And you're not going to get really true information from there. You're going to get information that's a little slighted one way or the other. And so you want to make sure that the sources are credible. The other thing is make clear the point of your evidence. Why are you using that evidence? What's the whole point of using it? You can't just bring it up and be like, "Oh yeah, yeah, this and this and that." Well, if it had nothing to do with your purpose or with your thesis, then why are you using it? So make clear the point of why you're using that evidence and why'd you choose it. Okay. The next thing is reasoning. Now, when we're talking about reasoning, just to be clear, let me make sure the page, we're on page 340 right now. Reasoning is really the idea, the process of drawing a conclusion on the basis of evidence. And what that means is based on this and based on that, we can conclude this, right? And so, you take information from all these different sources, and based on that information, you can come up with a certain conclusion. You reason that, right? So you hear a lot about detectives and other types of similar characteristics where you assume something based on the evidence. Where does the evidence take you? And based on that evidence, you're going to assume this. That's your reasoning. Now, you can reason from specific instances, and that reads reasoning that moves from one particular fact to a general conclusion. And what that means is the example that it gives in the book, fact number one is my physical education course last term was easy. Fact number two, my roommate's physical education course was easy. Fact number three is that my brother's physical education course was easy. So what can we conclude from that? Well, that physical education is easy, right? If all these other people are saying that it's easy, it's probably easy, right? So you can kind of reason that. The next thing we have is reasoning from principle. Okay, now when we're talking about reasoning from principle, it's the reasoning that moves from a general principle to a specific conclusion. So let's see the example that it gives in the book. In the book, it says, number one, all people are mortal. No, number two, Socrates is a person. Number three, therefore Socrates is mortal. So if all people are mortal, and I'm one of those people, well then you could say that what? Well then I'm mortal too, right? So it's reasoning from principle. The next one is causal reasoning, and this is reasoning that seeks to establish the relationship between causes and effects. Okay, so basically, I tell my kids, it's like, hey, you go outside, you're gonna catch a cold if you play in the rain. Well, you kind of get that. It's if you go off in the rain and you get all wet and then you come in and you don't dry yourself, are you likely to get sick? Yeah. Why? because we've seen it happen before. We've seen instances growing up ourselves or other people where they get sick because they don't clothe themselves because they're all wet, they're drenched. These are sort of those things that your mom or your dad tells you. Why? Cause and effect, right? Um, the next one is analogical reasoning. In analogical reasoning, it's reasoning in which a speaker compares two similar cases and infers that what is true for the first case is also true for the second, right? So, for example, if you're good at tennis, you might be good at ping pong, right? If you're a good quarterback, you might be a good pitcher, right? Quarterback throws the ball, a pitcher throws the ball. So, what's the likelihood of you being good at both? Very likely, right? So you can reason that. Now, as we move forward, though, one of the things that we have to worry about are fallacies. And fallacies is when you try to reason something, but why you reason it doesn't necessarily always make sense, right? So the first one is a hasty generalization. And the hasty generalization is a fallacy in which a speaker jumps to a general conclusion on the basis of insufficient evidence, right? You meet someone for the first time and they were just rude. And all of a sudden, you have a friend that starts dating that person and you're like, I don't like them. No, they're just so rude to me. Well, you're making a hasty generalization that based on one instance, based on the evidence of one time that you met that person, that they're rude. It's very likely that they had a bad day, something was going on, we're not all together there. Well, what happened? Well, we jumped to conclusions. We made a hasty generalization based on very little evidence that may not be entirely true, right? The other one is a false cause. A false cause is a fallacy in which a speaker mistakenly assumes that because one event follows another, the first event is the cause of the second event. This is where we kind of make assumptions that don't make sense. So let's go when it comes to cause and effect. So I always sort of hear this sometimes when in the summer. Sometimes I hear somebody say, "Oh, this is earthquake weather." Earthquake weather. Well, yeah, it's all hot in summer. Well, when did you infer that heat and summer um, lead to earthquakes? There is no such thing, um, as far as I know, and as far as I've been told. So, with that being said, you can't use something like, oh, it's earthquake weather because earthquake weather doesn't exist. Okay? Now, the next one that we have is an invalid analogy. Now, an invalid analogy is an analogy in which two cases being compared are not essentially alike. And a great saying goes along with this when somebody says, "Oh, you're comparing apples to oranges," right? And it's like, well, the things that you're comparing don't make sense. Well, you let Mike go off to the movies by themselves. Well, yeah, Mike's 18. You're 6, right? You can't compare yourself because you're both different people, right? In other words, so the analogy doesn't make sense, right? The next thing is bandwagon. And it's a fallacy which assumes that because something is popular, it is therefore good, correct, and desirable. And most of you have heard this term when you say, "Oh, join the bandwagon," or "You're a bandwagon fan." The Patriots got all these fans, and you just started becoming a Patriots fan for football if when they started winning. Well, yeah. Why? Because they were popular, right? And so the idea here is that just because something is popular with a whole bunch of people doesn't mean that it's good, doesn't mean that it's right, doesn't mean that it's correct. Okay. The next thing is a red herring. A red herring is a fallacy that introduces an irrelevant issue to divert attention from the subject under discussion, right? And I always sort of remember this from I think it was the movie Up by Disney. And it's like you have the dogs talking and they're bickering with her, and then someone says squirrel, and then they quickly look away. Squirrel has nothing to do with the conversation, but because they said it, it diverts the attention. And so red herring is really the idea of you're having an argument with somebody or you're talking to somebody, and then that person brings up something that had nothing to do with what you were talking about, but diverts the attention. And it's like, wait, we're not even talking about that. Why are you bringing that up? And so that's what a red herring is. Okay. The next thing we have is an ad hominem. And an ad hominem is a fallacy that attacks the person rather than dealing with the real issue in dispute. And then ad hominem basically means that that person might be right. You know, you're arguing with that person, you're debating with the person, and that person says something that is totally correct, and the other person says, well, you know, you're short, and you know, you are never on time. Well, what does either have to do with me? What it does it matter how tall I am? What does it matter how often I show up on time? Am I correct? Right? And so instead of attacking me, you know, instead of attacking what I'm saying, you're attacking me personally, and that really doesn't make you right either, right? The next thing that we have here is either or, and an either or is a fallacy that forces listeners to choose between two alternatives when more than two alternatives exist. So think of it this way: you want to get something to eat, right? So you want to eat a burger. So, you know, the person you're with, and they're like, well, I don't know if I want to have a burger. I'm not sure. And then you say, well, okay, I'll give you two choices. We can either go to In and Out or we can go to The Habit. Well, they're both burger places. You're not really giving them much of a choice. Now, granted, The Habit, you know, has salads and stuff, but really the idea here is you're not really giving all the choices. What about Chick-fil-A? What about Chipotle? What about all these other restaurants? But you didn't. You said this or that to try to kind of limit the choices. In this case, limit the choices to where it benefits you. Okay. The next one is a slippery slope, and that's a fallacy which assumes that taking a first step will lead to subsequent steps that cannot be prevented. And sometimes you hear this when somebody says you give them a finger, they take a hand. You take a hand, they take an arm. Um, that's not necessarily true, right? This is you're making an assumption here that because you do something, it's going to lead to something else, or something else is going to happen, and it's not necessarily the case, right? The next thing is you appeal to tradition, and this is a fallacy which assumes that something old is automatically better than something new. And this is sometimes very common when you go to a place of work where you're, especially when you're new, your manager, your trainer will say, "Oh, we'll do it this way," or "And you got to do this." And then when you start asking questions like, "Oh, well, why can't we do it this way?" And then the response is, "Well, we've always done it this way." Right? Okay, but just because you've always done it that way doesn't mean that it's what? Correct. Now, on the other side of that, though, is you have appeal to novelty. An appeal to novelty is a fallacy which assumes that something new is automatically better than something old. Just because it's new and it seems better, it doesn't mean that it is. Sometimes things are constant and things are old because they work. Okay? So there's that. The next thing is appealing to emotions. Now, if you're trying to persuade someone, right? A lot of times you're going to appeal to their emotions. You know, and this is sometimes when you fall into that scenario of someone asking for money in the holidays, for example. You know, if someone's trying to convince you to buy a car, there's an exchange of money, right? I want you to buy this. I want you to go here. Then it's always like an exchange, right? You give me money, I give you something back. But how do people, especially those who are a nonprofit, how do they get money from you? And a lot of times it's they appeal to your emotions, right? Because when you give money to a nonprofit, you're not getting anything back other than maybe a good feeling, right? That I gave. And that's what they're trying to give you. They're trying to give you an emotion of happiness, right? And so this is when you start seeing a lot of the PETA commercials, the dog commercials with the Sarah McLachlan song, and you start seeing during the holidays, you know, if you give so much, you'll be helping this people. Well, they're appealing to your emotions at that point. And when you look at the word pathos, pathos is the name used by Aristotle for the modern students of communication referred to as emotional appeal. So when someone says there's a lot of pathos there, or your speech is based on pathos, then that means it's basically using emotions to get your point across. And this is where I said something about, oh, pretty please, right? My daughter will do that, right? She'll give me you know, the look or the pretty pleases, and so she appeals to my emotions in trying to get what she wants, which she usually does. All right. The next one is generating emotional appeals. You want to use emotional language. You know, if you're going to appeal to someone's emotion, you're not just gonna say you're gonna feel good You're going to say, you're going to have a feeling of giving that comes from your heart, right? It really appeals to the emotions, using words and giving vivid examples about how exactly that's going to feel. You're going to feel like you're looking down on everyone, knowing that you are part of the solution. Like, really? All right. Right? And you want to make sure that you speak with sincerity and conviction. And it's okay to use emotion by all means. If that's a way that you want to be able to persuade people, you can. But if you are, be sincere about it. Say it with conviction. Now, this sort of leads to ethics and emotional appeal. And this is where you get things like crocodile tears, for some of you who may know that term. And this is really refers to the idea that someone is crying but there's no emotion behind it. They're manipulating you, right? They're crying just to invoke emotion, but they don't really feel that way, right? So that's where sort of ethics and emotions come in. It's like someone's playing with my emotions. Well, that's not really right, and we have to be aware of it. Anyways, so this is chapter 17. I hope you enjoyed it. Um, I'm going to load this up so that you can have a view. If you have any questions, feel free to email me out. All right, take care. Bye bye.